So I suppose some caveats, and first things first when I do this, I'm not a blacksmith, I'm not a swordsmith, and I'm not a metallurgist. I struggle with that word. I end up being a metallurgist or a meteorologist. But I just wanted to sort of address something that I used to think of as a kid. When I was a kid, there was no real internet, so I'm talking like the mid-80s here, so there wasn't really the internet. A big thing on the telly at the time was Shogun, and Japanese culture was quite a big deal, certainly in my life, but as far as I could tell, its influences were felt throughout most of pop culture in the mid-80s. And what this meant was there was a great love of all things Japanese, and the rumours that were going around were these sort of million-fold katanas, where the blade was drawn out. Imagine, you know, not just as a lump as we'll see in a minute, but the blade was drawn out and then somehow magically folded 1,000,000 times. I mean, it had been a phenomenal thing, and what was going through the minds of most of the kids, I was one of them at the time, was that somewhere there's this swordsmith making this beautiful blade and then folding it in half and drawing it and repairing it back, then folding it in half again, and doing that 1,000,000 times. Could you imagine? I'll have to do the maths. I'll see if I can do the maths, if it's sort of like, I don't know, 10 minutes between each fold, just how long that would have been. I'll try and put it in the bottom here. I'll get my fingers the right way around. I'll stick it in the bottom down here, just how long that would take a single swordsmith to do. But that was kind of what we thought was going on. Obviously I'm a bit older and wiser, and the internet's been invented, and all these things, so we can check these things out now. And I just thought, just for a laugh, I'd see how long it would take to sort of get some folds into a piece of material. But I'm not really set up for making blocks of material out of different pieces, so I thought I'd do what I've always said I do on these things, is if you're trying to work out a pattern for something and the material will hold, use plasticine. Particularly as a blacksmith, if you're trying to become a blacksmith and you're striking out, you don't know the first thing about it, you don't even have any tools, but you want to start learning how metal moves, buy some plasticine. Get some blocks, is the test piece I was just doing earlier, and as you strike it with your finger, that more or less is how metal will move. So you can learn and do things and pattern things in cheap plasticine. And of course it's not quite the same because it sticks and does all these things, but as a starter for 10 it's pretty good. So why fold material? Let's start with that. And do this in a some sort of order and some sort of semblance of instruction and assistance. Why would you fold material anyway in the first place? Well, you do end up with a Gucci looking pattern at the end. Well, you can do. I doubt we will in the plasticine, but you can do, and I'll put some links into the details below the video to point at other blacksmiths who do marvellous work with various blades and bits and bobs, because they're out there and you can see them doing this in metal. But why do it in the first place? Well, metal now, I buy a sheet of metal, I haven't got one handy, they're all in the corner over there, but I buy a big 2 metre by 1 metre sheet of metal, and basically if this was the sheet of metal, I can be pretty much sure that its properties will be the same in that corner as they will be in the middle as they will be at that end. But that's a modern luxury. Back in the day this stuff was beaten out by guys with hammers and all this sort of stuff, and it might have inclusions and crud inside it that would make it stronger or weaker or brittle or whatever. And if you're making a sword, you can't afford to have that. You know, this knife is a modern knife. Just trying to see if can't quite work out who made it, but it's a modern knife. I've carved the end off because I use it for a certain thing, but it has a certain flex and strength and ability. This is just a bit of mild steel, and it has completely different properties. You see, I can bend that just like that there, and I think, yeah, here we go. This is a piece of steak knife material, and I can't move that for love nor money. So those 3 different properties in one piece of metal would mean my sword might snap, it might bend, it might not take an edge, and so on. So that was why you would mix up this, and even at the bloomery you might find guys doing this. And again, there's people going to this tremendous depth, so take my word for it in this one, and then I'll put, like I say, I'll put some links in, you can see it all happening. But what you want to do is you want to have a mixture of metals in your block that you're going to make. Because then as you fold and push these together, it creates a more of a homogeneous lump of metal that has consistent properties. throughout it. There are different ways of doing this, but I'm doing this Japanese Japanese way of doing it because it's where I started with Shogun and all of that sort of stuff. Like I say, back in the 80s, they weren't making these big blades. They were using techniques perhaps similar to this. So what you do is you get your lump of metal, you heat it up, stick it in some water or a quenching thing, and you hit it with a hammer. And sometimes it will shatter, and sometimes it'll be quite spongy. And that shows you the properties of the different bits and pieces. And you gather those into piles, and then you create, not as easily as this obviously because this is just plasticine, you create a layered block of steel or iron, whatever. And you can see what's going to happen here, and what I'll do is I'll talk through the first one till I run out of things to say, and then I'll just get on, speed the video up, because you know this isn't as cool as watching a guy do it with actual steel and all the flames and the bits and pieces. So you can see here the first brick shape that you create, it's going to have gaps and bits and pieces in it. Now this is obviously just made of plasticine though, so we don't really care about those gaps. But you'd have to fill that with flux and do all the clever things that proper blacksmiths have to do. So there we go. And very often what you'll see, I won't do it with this one because it's completely unnecessary because it's not hot, is they will weld a handle on it. Because it saves you having to use tongs and so on, and you just take the metal that's outside of your weld. So you'll often see that shape. So there we go. And like I say, plasticine beautifully mimics hot steel. Now you can use a hammer if you want, and if you've got an anvil and you're trying to figure something out, just go at it really gently. I'm just going to use my hands because it's easier for the camera here. And what you start to do is you start to compress this down. Okay, so imagine this is all being done with hammers, got flux in between the various layers. You squeeze it down, try and keep it as evenly as you possibly could. Pushing it down, and already what you've created is a far more homogeneous lump of steel. And these things have different uses. So if you end up with the really brittle steel, that'll take an edge wonderfully and be really sharp, but it won't flex very much. So you'd save that, and what I might do at the end is to show it is you can open up the block of more homogeneous flexible steel, strong flexible steel, and you can put that brittle line in down the end, and that's what you draw out. But like I say, I'm not a swordsmith, so this is very much sort of the Ladybird book introduction level to it. I just been meaning to do this forever because I was gobsmacked as a kid that they could fold this stuff a million times. I just couldn't see how they could do it. And then I discovered that they sort of did and sort of didn't. So we've started here, before I go cutting this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers. Get ourselves a pen. Like I say, once you can see what's happening, there's no magic to it, so I won't sit here for the 20-30 minutes it's going to take me to do this even in plasticine. And most steels would have this done to them if they were to be specialist steels, certainly for knives, blades of any sort and so on, back in the day. So like I said, there just wasn't that consistency. And then what we're going to do, draw that out a bit more. What you're looking to try and do is keep it as a brick shaped as you can. There we go. And I've seen some Japanese swordsmiths do this on video, so one day when I go, I can never pronounce it, Tagahammer, I want to go and see the dirty great block they make that only the sort of master swordsmiths can make their swords from. It'd be remarkable to see, and I saw it on a documentary around them sometime. But by wiping that now, often in modern terms, to get all of the hammer scale and the flux and the crud off, we use metal brushes. Scratch that across. But in the videos I saw of this master swordsmith in Japan, he was using straw to wipe all that off. And of course what that's doing is it's putting carbon into the material, so you're creating a higher carbon content anyway. Right, so that'll do for now, I think. It's not the best, but that's why I chose the different colours. They're in there somewhere. Generally one side stays a bit better than the other. That's why I don't do this for a living. And you make an incision about 9/10 of the way through. Obviously you do this over an anvil with a proper little tool, and then what you do is you fold that over like so, and you can see, if I bring that up, you create this interesting cake, layered cake. And what we've just done is our layers now are 12, and this just goes up and up exponentially. Exponential increases are something we're coming to learn a lot about in these, not quite post-coronavirus days yet, but in these coronavirus days. Exponential growth and all this sort of stuff is stuff we're hearing about quite regularly on the news. So it shouldn't be too hard for us now to gather. It was something I always struggled with as a kid anyway. Exponential. Sounded awfully like science. I just wasn't interested in science as a kid too much. I wish I had been, because I'm sort of interested at a low level into it now. But you can see what's happening here. The reason I'm just talking through this one is because there's something interesting that's worth of note here. I'll try and use my practice piece I had earlier. Now you can see at the ends here it's starting to get a bit away from me. So because it's plasticine, I can upset it quite easily, but you'd have to watch that working with hammers, and I tend to drift along a bit. But what you can do, if this one, you can see this was my practice one. You see those different layers in there. Now like I say, you need to get a proper swordsmith or somebody, not me, monkeying about like this. Use my knife. But if you were to cut that, like that, pretty invisible, but you can hold that up. You can see, because the colours I've used, they've blended in quite nicely. You can see the different shapes in there. So what you can start to do is you make another block, mixing them together in different ways. And then when you draw that out, you'll end up with a different pattern altogether along the length of the blade. And a bit of acid draws it all out lovely, and you can see it wonderfully. So like I say, I mean, I'm going to say this is a Japanese method. It was just introduced to me as a Japanese method. But if you see the Sutton Hoo swords, they were plaiting these different types of material together, doing things in different ways. So like I say, I'll just fold this one, and then I'll shut up. And well done for sticking with me if you're still here and you haven't just sped it up or gone, oh, flipping that, he's using plasticine. I thought this was going to be a bit more Gucci than that, and you'd be doing it in steel. Well, I'm not doing it in steel because I'm not a blacksmith or a swordsmith, and I don't have the facilities. I just thought this was an interesting video to make, with a little bit of history thrown in. So we make our billet to about the same size again as before. I guess you could have a block that will make sure you're always cutting it at the same size, so that there's a uniformity to what's going on. Something I've always fancied doing is making something like this for real, but I haven't got the time or the facilities really. Pally with one of my blacksmith friends and see if he can waste a day with me. So again, I'm just doing it by eye, but cut that in two, 9/10 of the way down. Obviously take that over to an anvil and draw it round and bring that over, yeah, just about halfway. And now we're on 24 layers, and you can see how this quickly starts to grow. So what I'll do is I'll shut up and I'll speed the film up, and if anything occurs to me I'll try and say it. at the end. So if you stick with us, let's see how many folds I can get in this before it just becomes a solid homogeneous lump, which has its own value, but if you wanted to pattern it, you'd need to stop somewhere a bit sooner than perhaps I will be. So I'll catch you on the other side. There we go. Before I go, there's 24 layers. So we go. You can see how those layers now are starting to create some interesting patterns. So we get pattern welded materials from. But we're on, what is that, 12, 18, 192 layers. Pretty soon after this it'll start to get so small we might not be able to see it. That's why I've used the contrasting colours. In a proper lump of steel now, these colours start to become difficult to discern, and you have to know what you're doing basically, I guess. Get some acid on there and so on. So again, about halfway. There we go, 192 layers. Well done if you're still watching, by the way. You haven't fallen asleep. I want to watch something more interesting. There you go, 192 layers. So you can see that exponential growth, and you start getting in these bigger numbers. Just means it doesn't take quite as long as you imagine, or as certainly as I imagined as a teenager, that there was some poor smith sat there almost all of his life, I would guess. I'll still do the maths on that. Folding a piece of steel along a whole length of a blade 1,000,000 times. I don't even know if 1,000,000, what that would look like. I suggest that 1,000,000 you'd probably end up with a really homogeneous lump of steel, which would be really strong and really flexible if you've got the materials right. Whether you'd see a pattern on it, still I don't know. And that's part of it as well, isn't it, I guess, is the artistry that's involved. It's not just a blade, it's not just a sword, it's not just some guy wielding it. It's art, it's religion, in whatever form that took. Because don't forget, although we tend to in the West imagine that this was a skill known only to the master swordsmiths of some sort of magical feudal Japan. It was used throughout history. I think certainly there's Viking, or the Viking era, pattern welding. Certainly Anglo-Saxons were pattern welding. And the reason I don't know what they were doing over in the Far East at that time is because my Far Eastern history in that period is really quite poor. It's not to say they weren't doing it, I just don't know if they were. So this is something that basically when you end up in a proper Iron Age, that everyone was doing. Because alloys and stuff were understood, I guess. This wasn't such a far leap. And you could see just by hitting a bit of metal whether it snapped or whether it moved well, what it was going to do. So there we go, so we're currently at 192, sorry, layers. And you can see that, you know, there's different bits to it. It would be quite interesting drawn out across the length of a blade, I guess. Right, so if I cut that in two, again, you can see in the end there, it's getting, obviously it's been dragged a bit by the plasticine, by the knife, sorry. But that's, oh, what would that be? 4, 18, right. 384 layers now. Made that a bit short. Never mind. That's where I'm not measuring, I guess. If you're doing this for real, you'd have measures out and doing it a lot more seriously. This will just end up in my plasticine pile when it's done. For the next time I need to work a pattern out. My wife uses plasticine a lot more than me because she makes metal flowers. It's a great way of working out the patterns. I'll add a link to her Etsy shop, there you go. And if any of you are in a bind looking for a gift for somebody, she makes roses, gerbers, daisies, all sorts of flowers out of copper, bronze, steel, aluminium and so on. So you can look like you put a lot of effort into an anniversary gift or the likes. The truth was, you were loafing on YouTube. Or loafing, I suppose. You're at lunch break on YouTube, or researching something or whatever, and somebody mentioned these flowers. There you go. It's a very holistic day today for us all. But anyway, I'll get back to just folding this a couple more times. Until I get bored of working in silence. I'll watch some more. So I'll probably do one more layer, because what's happening is, well, what happens with the steel is this is just turning into sort of beigey colour. Well, that doesn't happen with the steel, obviously. This is turning into a beigey lump of plasticine. As the materials become more and more mixed and it homogenises, if there's such a word. So what you end up with is if you've got your proportions right at the beginning, as a real swordsmith, not as a plasticine smith, is you end up with the best of both worlds. You have the strength of the more brittle stuff, and you have the flexibility of the softer stuff. On a single-edged sword like a katana, which is where we sort of started with this, or a wakizashi I suppose, or a tanto or whatever, I think you have that down the back edge of the blade, and in the majority of the blade, so it can withstand some wobble and not just snap into. The great mythology around Japanese katana and so on, that they're so sharp they can split atoms, not quite, but you know what I'm saying. And they're no doubt they're wonderful works of art, but so are most swords that were well made in whatever period by the swordsmiths of their era. In one way or another, the likelihood is they're employing similar techniques to this one. If anybody knows anywhere on YouTube where you can watch real smiths doing this, let me know. So I lost the thread of where I was. I had a quick visit from my mum for lunch. There you go. So anyway, here we go. You can see we're on 12,000. Seam. So we'll give that a cut. Like I said just before I had my lunch, I was going to stop because it's just turning into a homogeneous lump. But let's give it a bit more, a couple more goes, just to show you how quickly you can get those layers into it. And to be honest, decent swords, axes and spears I've seen made by decent blacksmiths. We know their game, they do the pattern welding. They look fantastic, even when they've got really fine grains like this is producing now. The bit of acid and rub or whatever it is they use really picks out the grains of the piece well. And like I showed before, if you cut this into blocks you can end up with star patterns and all sorts of things, but I'll leave that for proper blacksmiths, which I'm certainly not one of. Anyone can heat a bit of metal up and smack it around, but you watch a proper blacksmith in action there. A joy to behold. The skills that they bring to their craft. There's a bit more to it than just hitting up a bit of metal and hitting it. In my humble opinion, anyway. There we go. What are we on? Hopefully I've got this right. So that's 16, 17... 5, 4, 2. 24,500 rolls. It's like a phyllo pastry. There you go. Imagine if that was all cleaned off, you could still see that grain quite well. So it would make for a nice spear or some such. So I wish I could sort of go back in time and see 15-year-old me and have a chat and just let me know that they weren't folding a sword edge a million times. It would just be insanity. Probably unachievable as well would be my guess, but I haven't taken particularly great care of this, to stop it from slowly skewing, which you'd have to, I guess, with a piece of, well, I don't suppose you'd have to, but you might want to with a piece of metal. And obviously I haven't got to add things or care about things like flux and hammer scale and all of that. But you can see there we go. Bit of a wider grain on there, something happened. $24,000. Yeah. There we go. 1.5 million folds. Boggles my mind. Exponentialism, if that's a word. But oops, combine harvesters are on their way or doing something. But 1,572,864 folds in this piece of plasticine. So if this was a piece of metal, you could then go make a katana with it. But teenage me would have thought you could split the atom with at some point in the future. Because there was no greater or stronger blade than a katana made by one of the great sword masters, or master swordsmiths of medieval Japan. At least that's what I thought at the time. But we all learn. Let's have a look. I mean, there's a big seam in there, but that will help. It's just turned into almost a homogeneous lump. I can't cut it, unfortunately. There's nothing I can do to really sort of show the layers, but you can still see them in there just about, some of the bigger ones anyway, where I wasn't being particularly careful. So there we go. It was possible to fold a piece of steel back in the day a million times.